Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table, where we discuss issues of God and culture. My name is Kasey Olander. I'm the Web Content Specialist here at the Hendrick Center at DTS. And today our topic is trauma. We did do an episode about this already, if you're curious. That gave an overview of this topic, an introduction to trauma. It was episode number 548, and it was called Understanding Trauma. So if you haven't heard that, we would commend it to you, encourage you to go listen to that. It was first released in April of 2023, so give it a listen if you're new to this topic or if you're just interested. We also, before we jump into our conversation, do want to say, perhaps you deduced this from the title of the episode, but some of the subject matter might be difficult for people or kind of heavy, hard to listen to, in the fact that we're addressing, the topic of trauma. So we would caution you in that. And if you're not in a spot for it, we would encourage you to listen to some of our other content. We have episodes about things like friendship and fashion. So if you'd prefer that, if you'd rather have a lighter topic for today, enjoy that. But if you're interested in trauma, if you're like, I'm good to go and I'm ready, then we'll jump into our conversation. So today we're joined by Dr. Andi Thacker. She's Associate Professor of Counseling Ministries at DTS. Andi, thanks for being back with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. We're also joined this time by Josh Freeman. He is Adjunct Professor of Counseling Ministries here at DTS, and he's also Director of Counseling at Dallas Life Homeless Recovery Center. So thanks for being with us, Josh.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I mentioned that we did this previous episode about trauma that gave just a broad overview of the topic. We defined trauma as anything that shocks the system, anything that it could be too much, too little, anything that sends a person's nervous system into fight or flight or a shutdown. So that was kind of the definition that we're working with. But we also, Andi's hot take from our last episode was that trauma is not just like a niche group of people that it applies to, but we said that everyone has experienced trauma. So it's not just maybe a distant relative or somebody that, has a small subset of the population, but rather that everyone has experienced trauma. So this is an episode that is appropriate and, applicable to literally everyone. Mm-hmm. Since we live in a fallen world. So in this episode, we're going to hope to focus on types of trauma. We might get a little bit more specific about the causes and the effects. We'll still do kind of a high-level overview of these things, since we don't really have time to plumb the depths in the next 45 minutes or so. But we'll get a little bit more specific into what trauma might look like and how it could affect our society and the places that we live. And so I guess, Andi, why don't I start with you and asking, what is the importance of learning about trauma, about types of trauma? How could this be of value to our listeners?
Yeah, well, I think because most everyone walks around with some sort of impact from trauma, we have the potential to either use that for healing or hurt others because of our unresolved experiences. So part of it is just being safe and not acting out of the brokenness that we find ourselves in.
Sure. If we're not aware of something, then we can't address it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Josh, anything to add to that?
I think that's exactly right. I think we're often walking around unaware of what's happening with us, and so a growing awareness of our own experience, our own history, and then as well as what we've experienced and how it is either limiting us or being a limitation or causing harm to other people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we want to be able to, I think you mentioned being safe, like for other people, and also finding healing and wholeness, that we can encourage one another towards that end, and also that we can make steps towards that for ourselves. Mm-hmm. What are y'all's thoughts about why maybe this hasn't been addressed as much historically, and why this is an important topic for right now?
I think it's uncomfortable.
And
so there are a number of authors that would say this has been addressed historically, but in various contexts. And then inevitably we get too uncomfortable with it and we say, no, we're going to relegate that to like we're just going to not talk about it anymore. And then something else comes up. And so I think it is uncomfortable for us to recognize our own limitations, maybe coming to grips with the reality of a broken world, or that things might be less than ideal for us and maybe for the rest of our lives, or unideal for other people that we love and maybe for the rest of their lives too. So it's an uncomfortable topic. And I think that's why we often try to minimize it for ourselves. I can just get over this, or I can, or you should get over this, right? Like we start using that language.
Yeah. If it's inherently something that is like too much for our systems, then of course it makes sense that we'd be like, well, I'd rather not talk about that. Like I'd rather not address it, push it aside.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's grief-inducing too. And that discomfort, we're having to sit with an uncomfortable feeling. And like Josh said, it may never be resolved this side of heaven. And that does not feel good. Yeah, even saying that, I can sense that my body's like, yep, nope, I don't like that.
Don't like that.
And it's complicated in that oftentimes, especially if you look historically for the last 40 years, we have been approaching problems as I need to understand it, I need to intellectualize it. If I can understand it in my mind, then I can have power over it. And this is something that's complicated in that it does affect our mind, our will, and our emotions. It also affects our body. And there's a lot of things that make us uncomfortable with any one or multiple of all of those things.
Yes, that's a good thought too. We're integrated human beings. We're not just souls or just bodies, but the fact that we could be so affected by the world that we live in can also be alarming and potentially discouraging for people if we're not like, okay, I'm just going to solve this easy peasy 3-step problem and then we'll be on the other side of it. Like, yeah, it may not happen that way.
Yeah.
And a little cheekily, I guess, that a lot of us want to assume that the rules don't apply to us. We want to think that we're special, we're unique, and I might be able to help you with this, but obviously I'm not going to experience it the same way. And then when we do experience it, our self-concept, our understanding, maybe even our value gets messed up with this too. It hits all of those nerves for us.
Yeah. When in reality, I mean, it's part of being human, as opposed to like, if trauma affects everyone, it's not just a particularly weak subset of the population or anything like that. It is a universal reality that all of us are living with and walking through. Yeah. So as far as what trauma might look like, and we talked about, how it can be caused by a number of different things, depending on the person, the situation, everyone's different. But are there like certain categories of trauma? Are we about to talk about the 5 types of trauma? Then we can just understand them and then organize them easily? Or how are there ways to categorize trauma?
Well, that's part of the complicated nature of it, is there's not one set universal understanding of there's these 5 types. Different authors and researchers have put forth different categories. Some broad brushstrokes would be chronic versus acute, big T versus little t, which we referenced in the last podcast, complex versus not complex. So those are kind of broad brushstrokes, but again, it's complicated because we don't have this like really cut and dry set. You fall right in this category here.
And that's kind of some of the like difficulty and nuances that we've been addressing. Like, not only is it difficult maybe like emotionally for us to talk about, it also is kind of hard to quantify.
Yeah, and making that even more complicated is the fact that it is subjective. So 2 people in the same experience might experience it very differently. The repercussions might be, one person might experience it as very traumatic and experience PTSD symptoms, and another person might be able to assimilate the experience that happened to them, and they will not experience it as traumatic or experience PTSD symptoms. Yeah. So it is very subjective, and it also is more added to that complexity is the fact that the logic gets thrown out the window sometimes. So somebody might perceive a threat that might not even be there, and they experience it as traumatic. And so then somebody goes, well, that didn't even happen. That wasn't even a threat. That wasn't even and it's like, but the perceived threat, the subjective experience makes it difficult to make it a one-size-fits-all. That's why it's personalized.
Yeah. So, Andi, you talked about things, for example, like acute versus chronic trauma. Can you kind of tease that out a little bit? Like, what are the differences? What do those terms mean?
Yeah, so acute is short-lived, maybe one event, whereas chronic is an ongoing type of traumatic experience. So chronic might be microaggressions or living with food insecurity, things that are not easily resolved. It could be caring for an aging parent. There's so many things that don't ever get resolved this side of heaven. Acute may be like a natural disaster. Now, would you add to that, Josh?
Yeah, acute could be something like even just a traumatic pregnancy or traumatic delivery, right? Something that lots of people experience, but it is experienced that time, and then it has long-reaching effects.
Yeah. So are there particular subsets of the population that might be a little more prone to experience one or the other? Or is it kind of just dependent on the time frame?
I think it's really dependent upon the time frame. Also, like Josh said, it's subjective. So we all carry different resources within our bodies. Also within, we have different resources monetarily that impact how we can deal with things. So depending upon the resources that we have at our disposal, that can really impact who is more susceptible. A lot of times kids or anyone who is doesn't have as much agency or choice is more at risk because they don't have the power inherent to escape, to change the circumstances. So, my 6-year-old is far more at risk than I am because he can't get in his car and flee. He can't, go to the bank and get something because he doesn't have a checking account. He is potentially more of a greater risk. He also hasn't had as much time to live to grow his internal resources. So ideally, I should have more resources than he does psychosocially and emotionally at my disposal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that is along with that, like, he doesn't have as much autonomy or agency, and he's a lot more vulnerable. And so I would add, though, that especially given the person that might be listening to this, there are vocations that are innately more risk presenting, such as working as a firefighter or a police officer, that we think, oh, that person is going to be both under the chronic stressors that can produce trauma, such as I don't know when I'm going to get called out to a really hard call, or they also have a higher probability of a single or acute aspect of trauma, right? Where something might happen that they go, oh, this is life altering. I understand that tonight my life is different and I have a new perspective from here on out. Yeah. But in addition to those that we would normally think of, the police officers, the firefighters, the military, I think the helping profession is much more at risk of experiencing trauma. And that's because we're working with people who are more vulnerable. Our prevalence for vicarious trauma or experiencing my trauma through somebody else is much greater as well. So people that work, youth workers at churches, people that work in schools, but then also pastors and ministry leaders, that much higher risk.
Yeah. Yeah. So in addition to the acute and chronic trauma, there also, you mentioned vicarious trauma. Are the symptoms of these different kinds, might they all look similar, or are there kind of some distinctions that you would identify?
I think by and large they look very similar. Yeah, I think when we're looking at trauma symptoms, they often look you have to start getting much more in the weeds to start separating what some of this looks like. But I would say the acute would be more like the PTSD experiences. So that hyperarousal or the hypervigilant, the constant threat that I'm experiencing, where I could jump into a different state of mind, versus the chronic, where I've developed a mindset that I've incorporated more into my working life, and that might be a little bit harder to assess in myself or see in other people. I might even see them as strengths in other people because they were effective coping strategies when I was going through my chronic trauma.
Sure. Yeah. Anything to add to that?
I think that's great.
Yeah. So how are these things best addressed? Do we address them differently if, for example, vicarious trauma, if you're hearing from somebody else, do we address that differently than something that like you just experienced today? So, for example, like a car accident or something like that? Go ahead, Josh.
So do we address it differently in ourselves? I don't think we experience it very differently in ourselves. I think the goal would be for me to be a healthy, congruent person that's able to incorporate into my nervous system, my body, as well as my mind and my emotions, what I experienced, and for me to have community that I can process that with, so that this thing that I experienced doesn't get locked in an unhealthy pattern. And so whether that means in a session that I have with a client, or a supervision I have with a counselor, where I'm experiencing things from their story that I'm experiencing, or if I experience a car wreck on my drive home, I'm wanting to close the loop on the whole experience for me. Either way.
I mean, like to give it some sort of like resolution and make sure you relegate it like to the past. Is that what you mean by close the loop?
Not relegate it to the past necessarily, but where this arousal that happens, like my nervous system goes crazy, that I incorporate that into my life, and I don't then try to hide it. I don't try to push it down. I don't try to avoid it, so that it gets locked and comes back up in an unhealthy way.
When you don't expect it, maybe. Okay. So what about addressing these different kinds for other people? Would it be a different way that you would address somebody who has acute trauma versus chronic trauma?
That all kind of depends on the model that a clinician ascribes to. So there's various different models that talk about addressing trauma. When we're talking about the layperson who's spending time with someone that they care about, or a church worker who's ministering to someone, their approach to addressing these things is going to stay kind of more kind of higher level, surface level, so to speak, of being present with them, being accepting, and hopefully not adding on to that traumatic experience by disenfranchising this person, invalidating, being a safe person. From a clinical viewpoint, it kind of depends on where you start with someone. So if they've done significant work already, just like Josh was saying, you want it to be an integrated part of your experience. How integrated a person is when they come into treatment really impacts where you start with them in the healing process. So if someone is not integrated at all and they're not very aware of their experiences physically, emotionally, you have to start there, because part of processing trauma is you're going to get hopefully intimately acquainted with how you experience those things physiologically and emotionally. And so people that haven't ventured into that, going into their body, going into their emotions is really scary and oftentimes dysregulating, because part of the way we tend to cope when we have long chronic, when we have a history of trauma, is our body is constantly giving us information and talking to us. But if it's constantly saying, you're unsafe, you're in danger, a lot of times we have to put some distance between us and that stimuli or that information that the body is giving so that we can cope and we can just get through the day. And whatever that looks like, go to work, operate your car, care for kids, do whatever. And so part of that first step clinically is to help people first off, befriend their nervous system and know that this is a safe environment. And that takes a significant amount of time, just because the minute you overwhelm the system, you're sending that person right back into fight or flight or immobilization.
Yeah, so it takes some being careful and gentle with the way that we address this. We can't just be like, all right, tomorrow we'll be cured.
Yeah. And it's not like we're going to throw you in the deep end of the pool and see if you can swim. Hopefully you make it to the side. If you don't, we'll rescue you, but we're going to let you take on some water first. No, it's like we're going to just dip our toe in the shallow end, and then we're going to bring it back out, and we're going to go so slowly that we acclimate to the experience and we don't overwhelm the system and re-traumatize the person. And I think a lot of times that's something that can happen is like Josh said, we tend to intellectualize things. We think we can think our way or logic our way out of our pain, and we just want to get through it. And that actually is way more damaging than helpful. And
I wonder, too, if that's part of why we don't really have this eagerness to address trauma just in general, is because it takes so much time. And a lot of times we're used to what is instant, what is immediate, instead of being willing to enter into this however long process, because it could be an indefinite amount of time.
Yeah, and it really demands a flexibility. It demands me changing, right? Whether I'm working on this in myself or working with this with somebody else, or just somebody else experienced it that's close to me, it demands that I change to some extent. That requires a humility, an openness, a curiosity, these types of character qualities that not everybody has or have practiced a lot. But oftentimes we want the solution to be quick and simple, like you're saying, or painless. And most of the time that means somebody else needs to change so I can stay the same. And when we start talking about trauma, or when we start experiencing it face to face with a person in our small group, our children, our parents, we start recognizing that our world has to expand in how we think about things, that we're very resilient, but we're also susceptible. And so, yeah, it demands that we adjust and change.
Yeah. So how might somebody take those initial steps to cultivating those qualities that you're talking about, the humility and things like that?
Well, listening to this podcast would be one of those, right? Expanding some of our understanding. But like what Andi was talking about in the first steps of working with trauma is identifying it, creating safety and stability. And those can be really long. That can be a really long phase in the trauma journey. And so that requires evaluating it. That requires making sure that I'm not continuing to be in an unsafe place that's keeping my brain in this fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so cultivating a safe place with some safe people, relationship is almost always a part of that. I would say usually that safety is with a counselor experienced almost first and foremost, is the first time that they're experiencing a true, safe, and empathetic experience. But it can be with other people. But it has to, that's a big part of the first steps. And so if somebody has already been doing work on understanding themselves, or they've been doing work on accepting themselves, their work on accepting that they have value, they are starting at a different place. Maybe they're not putting their toe in the water, they're putting their foot in the water and then pulling it back. But those would be parts of that. And then let's say I'm talking about somebody who's experiencing a person who's experienced trauma, not my own, then it's that in order to garner more of that flexibility or curiosity, the big part on that is not oversimplifying a complex problem so that I can understand it, or so that I can have a sound bite or a TikTok or a here's what you need to do so that I can feel better about myself. So I would say continuing that thought is I need to be comfortable with discomfort, both mine and somebody else's. Okay.
Yeah. Anything to add to that for steps people can take?
Yeah, I think that's huge. That piece of being comfortable with the discomfort starts with you. So Brene Brown talks about how when we are going to empathize with someone, it's challenging because it forces us to get in touch with the feeling that they're experiencing within ourselves. So if if I'm going to be an empathic listener, that requires that humility because I have to touch that pain in myself. And if I'm not willing to do that, then that's going to interfere with my ability to be a safe landing spot for someone. And as a professional, part of the reason we don't work with family and friends is so we can create some of that professional distance. It's harder at times to be an empathic, understanding person with a good friend or a family member because their life intimately impacts my life. So if I'm listening to their struggle with an illness, it's impacting them, and I'm sad for them, but I'm also sad for myself because their illness impacts my life. If it's someone who I don't have a relationship with outside of the professional dynamic, then I can be a little more removed and get in touch with that in an abstract way. But that's a huge piece of humility because I have to stand in that place of I'm finite. Like any of this could happen to me at any time, and I'm vulnerable. And that's hard.
Yeah, we don't like that aspect of our humanity, having limits and, having things that are out of our control. So I want to, I think, nuance a couple of things. We've used the term complex to refer to just the fact that trauma is complicated and it's nuanced and it's layered. But I think you also alluded to complex trauma, maybe as a category. So, Andi, could you kind of describe the different ways that we're using that term?
Yeah, so there's the nuance and the complexity, that it's not cut and dry and everybody has a different experience and it's subjective. But there's also complex trauma where someone might experience trauma that continues over a number of years. It includes multiple facets of different areas in which they are impacted. And it could be complex from the perspective that they don't have as many resources to be able to address the complexity of the situation.
So is that would you say a type of chronic trauma? Or is it distinct from chronic?
It really depends on who you're
who you're reading.
Yeah, who you're reading.
Yeah.
Some authors will distinguish complex as having a long-term, but also it would be connected with somebody who would be younger, and it would be affecting their development. So complex trauma would be affecting development. But a lot of times when people are talking about complex trauma, it's exactly that. It's affecting all of these different areas very all of these different areas at the same time, right? And so so people use complex trauma often to point to more of the chronic but severe aspects.
Because it's far-reaching.
Yeah. Okay. And then adding in developmental trauma, which some people will use that term to talk about trauma that happens during the early years of formation. So technically, development never stops because the brain is always plastic and changing, or potentially changing to some extent.
For some people.
For some people, yes, with the right circumstances and the willingness. But like early in life, we know that the brain is still going to continue to form and develop up until like 25 or 30 years old. So trauma that happens during those formative years is going to have a different effect potentially than other trauma because it shapes how that brain forms. It shapes how a person views the world that they live in. And it's not to say that you couldn't have a life-altering viewpoint of the world later in life.
Sure.
It just, it really impacts attachment, which is how we anticipate relationships going for the rest of our lives. Those form early in life. So that can be a little bit more tricky to work with. It can have more long-standing repercussions because of when it occurs during the lifespan.
So at the risk of oversimplifying, you're saying that developmental trauma is really significant for people potentially because they're shaping how they might view the world for the rest of their lives. So if this, like something happens with a caregiver or whatever, they're like, oh, all adults must be like this. When in reality, maybe an adult who experiences a similar thing would already have the resources to realize, okay, that because this one person is this way, it doesn't mean everyone is this way.
Yeah. Well, sorry, go ahead.
Or they might be saying, I deserve this. Right. Whereas
As a
an
child.
adult, I might not say I deserved that. But
Yeah.
as a child, that might be the first message that I experience. I must deserve this.
Yeah, they have a mistaken view.
And then that gets carried on forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and some of why someone might say that is because God has uniquely situated us within the context of relationships. We have to have relationships to survive. That's not even just thriving, like survive. Without significant relationships and the care you need from those, in the worst case scenario, children have failure to thrive and they die. So because God put us under the care of other people, and because we are the only species that takes this long to be independent, we are very much at the mercy of how we experience those main caregivers. And that we need, in some ways, to believe that the people that are taking care of us love us and have our good at heart. And so a lot of times it's not uncommon for people who have experienced developmental trauma to take on the blame or to think it must be internally about me as opposed to about my caregiver. Like Josh said, as an adult, I can have a bad experience with someone and think, wow, that was not cool. Like, I did not like how they treated me. That really hurt. That wasn't okay. There is something not okay with them. We need to believe that our parents, our caregivers, are going to protect us. And when they don't, we tend to turn that self-talk inward to blame ourselves more so than others because we need to protect their image in our minds.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, not unlike how we image spiritual leaders throughout the lifespan, too.
You want to unpack that a little more?
Yes. Well, I mean, there's a special significance that, and it may not be only spiritual leaders, but with spiritual leaders, we ascribe authority. We anticipate that they will be safe, and they have a lot of power in our lives. And when they don't live out how we need them to be and how we anticipate them being, because they probably have their own trauma that's unresolved, they can leave a significant negative impact that can be very traumatizing, that is different than maybe other folks could have in our lives.
Because it's a unique position that people have, and I mean, a really significant role to steward, right?
But it also is connected to our identity, right? This is the person that we have as the face of what I'm believing about this community, is maybe even a voice piece for some of the things that I identify with. And so when things start happening to me from this person, or when I find out that this person has done things to other people, that can affect and negatively impact my own identity. It can be like when Andi was talking about this for a child, it can be this, wait, my world is not what I thought my world was.
Yeah, a sense of betrayal, even if it wasn't directly something against you, but the idea that, oh, this person wasn't doing what I thought they were doing, or, yeah. What are y'all's, I guess, advice for how to address people in that situation? Is there a change in the way that we should view spiritual authority, or is it just a matter of, as things come up, like addressing them that way?
Well, I think if we oversimplify, and we think that trauma is something that you just get over, or it's relegated to the past, it starts changing the way we think or the standard that we hold other people to. So recognizing that most likely people that are in places of authority or power or have quite a bit of lived experience, they have experienced their own things. And so not thinking that they've somehow missed it, or that everybody's operating out of a healthy, congruent personhood. So so part of it should be us not putting people up on a pedestal, or thinking that if somebody has the right theology, they're not going to experience some type of trauma. And then there is still an aspect of, depending on what we're talking about, there's an aspect of I'm going to be gracious and still choose to engage in relationship with this person. And then there also the aspect of that depending on the circumstances, this person might be very dangerous for me to engage with and continue a relationship with. So it's going to depend a lot on the circumstances, the person, and my own ability to relate with other people.
I think that's a great kind of jumping off point too, to kind of self-reflect, because many people who may listen to this podcast or who are part of our community are people of influence into other people's lives. And so to ask that question, where are my blind spots? Where is there woundedness that may not have been my fault, but it is my responsibility to deal with it, and to be humble in that way, and to maybe ask some really uncomfortable, hard questions of yourself.
Yeah. What are other ways that you would encourage people to reflect as they are listening and processing all this?
I think part of it is to reflect on in a kind way to yourself, because that whole piece, I think there is a piece that we, no matter what community you're a part of, there is a certain aspect of a stigma that we tend to other people in a way who have experienced trauma of, oh, well, if you're strong enough, then you wouldn't have that response, or you would have been able to withstand that. And to really know that it's not about strength, it's not about goodness or virtue. It's a part of living in a broken world, and to be safe enough in yourself where you can acknowledge that, I've had some woundedness, and it's okay to validate that. I really don't, I believe wholeheartedly we can't give away that which we don't possess. And so if I have a hard time validating my own experiences and trauma, it's going to be hard for me to do that for someone else.
Sure. Yeah. Anything to add to that, Josh?
I think the emphasis on self is a great place to go on that, and that is recognizing that some of my knee-jerk responses to hearing news of a particular person might be something that's been in me for a while that I haven't been addressing. And so I might have an exaggerated response, or it might be a response that I don't fully understand, or it might be different than other people's responses that I've been interacting with, or it might be in my circle or my community, and that could be a neon sign saying, hey, this is doesn't just have to be about this other person. This is rubbing up on some of my stuff.
So like self not in like a selfish way, like focusing only on myself, but in like a sense of stewardship, that if I, in whatever roles I happen to have, whatever capacities, whatever tasks are, at my disposal, then it's my job to do it to the best of my ability, to reflect on, who I am, how God has made me, and the things that have happened, and how best to address them. Because like you said, while it may not be someone's fault, it is still a responsibility. Yeah. What are y'all's, encouragements to people for how to identify trauma? I know we've talked about a number of different types of trauma, a number of different ways that it might play out. But yeah, if somebody's looking for the first time trying to do this introspection, how would you help them identify trauma?
I think some of the key things that pop up in our body is going to be like awareness, or my heart start beating, I might start getting sweaty, or my hands might start getting cold on something. It could be a memory that pops up routinely. So growing up, I got in this car accident in Atlanta, going up 400. I got in this pretty big car accident as a 17-year-old. And I go back, I still have family in Atlanta, and I will be even in an Uber with somebody else driving from the airport up to my parents' house. And all of a sudden I'll be like, wait, what's going on? And I'm like, oh, I'm coming up on the stretch of highway where I got in an accident. And so like my body's telling me,
before
hey,
you even
here's
notice.
this thing. And I'm like, what is going, oh, yeah, that's that. And then it happens here in Dallas when I experience a skid on the road or something like that. I'm like, oh, this thing is still here, right? Like there's still this safety response that says this has been impactful for you before. And so I think looking physically, there's those types of triggers. And what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. The body always talks first. And a lot of times that's our first neon sign, so to speak, of there's something going on, because it takes a couple minutes for our conscious brain to catch up with what's going. So paying attention to what your body says, and some of that is just being aware. A lot of times we're really disconnected from our bodies. And part of that is, to borrow from Jamie Smith, he says we're not just brains on a stick, but I think sometimes we like to live like we are. So being aware of, what is the sensation I feel in this moment? Peter Levine has a great book, little tiny book called Healing Trauma, and a lot of it is really befriending your body and your nervous system in the sense of just getting used to like what it feels like to feel water run across your arm, because we can be so disconnected as a mode of safety. It's not a bad thing. It's really adaptive. That we don't even know what that's like. But just, getting used to that and getting used to this is what my body says when I'm interacting with a skid. Also, too, sometimes our brains don't consciously remember things, but even seasonally things really impact us, especially depending upon the time of year. So if there's been a significant event that was traumatic that happened during the fall, as you start to venture into the fall, or faux fall, what we have here, summer 2.0, your body may start to, you may not be sleeping as well. You may have changes in your eating patterns. You notice that maybe you just have like a little low-grade depression, in the sense of like, it's not horrible. I can still get through the day, but I just don't feel like myself.
Sleep patterns, or you might be experiencing this in relationship with other people. They might, your response might be something that you don't intend. So you might be going back and apologizing for a statement you made or the tone of your voice when you were doing something, because it felt like an automatic response and not one that I was intentional with. It sometimes feel like it was out of character. So all of those experiences, I would say, can be indicators that a nerve inside me has been touched or brushed, and something's going on with me.
Yeah, those are really helpful examples to help people connect with, okay, how this might actually feel, for somebody identifying trauma for the first time. What would then be the next step that you would encourage them in, besides obviously practicing this? It's not like a one-time thing.
Well, I think if it's never been addressed, then part of it is to find a safe therapist who can really help you move into that space and explore what the trauma is. If it is something that you have processed through and you have addressed, this is an ongoing experience throughout the lifespan, that there are just seasons and times where you need to be extra kind to yourself. And so looking for ways that you can put margin into your world. So sometimes this is life stage, and you know that it's going to pass, and eventually you won't need as much margin. And then sometimes if you're dealing with, let's say, a chronic illness that's never going to be resolved, you may need to rearrange some of your values and priorities, in the sense of you sleep longer, you do more. I have a family member who is going through cancer treatment, and she has coined herself a stay-at-home cancer patient. And we laugh about it, but that is a great example of self-care through a traumatic experience.
Yeah. I wish we had more time to talk through all of these different things, but would each of you have maybe one last encouragement to our listeners as we kind of conclude our time here?
My encouragement would be for for the listener to grow in their own self-awareness. That oftentimes we try to bypass the awareness and bypass our own processing of what has taken place and jump into focusing on other people. And what we're doing with that is we're avoiding things for ourselves, and often causing more harm. So not thinking that this is a process that can be rushed or there are steps that can be bypassed. This is a long and difficult process that requires me to be aware and flexible. And so if I try to cut steps, I'm prolonging that for myself and for others. Mm-hmm. And to not think that that I can go through these steps with other people, that there are some steps for me, like emphasizing maintaining a place of safety, maintaining a relationship that's authentic and vulnerable, maintaining stability for a person, but not going in and thinking that we're going to go process somebody else's trauma.
Sure. Yeah. I'm hearing you say a lot about patience and, being willing to be flexible.
Yeah, I think sometimes the biggest thing that we need is somebody to sit with us and hold our hand, or to just say, well, let's just go for a walk, and we're not even going to talk about this. You just need somebody to be with you, mm-hmm. and I can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you, Andi?
I love that. I would say that, this is a difficult path to walk, and healing takes time. So to be really patient in that process, but also know there are ways to heal that are not going to be re-traumatizing. It's not like a no pain, no gain kind of thing. We want to make it hurt really bad, and that means we're healing. No, the healing process shouldn't be so overstimulating that it's re-traumatizing someone. So I think sometimes that fear of what am I getting myself into is really scary, but there are ways to walk this pathway and to process and to heal that will not be re-traumatizing.
Yeah, there's hope for people. It's not just that you have to live with it forever, but that...
Yeah, I think if we're thinking of it in terms of like a knee replacement, mm-hmm. right? I have this physical thing that has happened to my knee, and now I'm going to go through physical rehab. A lot of times what that physical therapist is doing is telling us to go slower than we want to do. They're saying this is the safe way of doing this, like what Andi was saying. We're going to dip our toe in and bring it out. We're not going to start doing a whole bunch of exercises. And that's the benefit of having a third party, like a professional that you're working with, and who's going to walk on that slow journey with you, mm-hmm. as opposed to oftentimes our knee-jerk reaction, which is, oh, you just share everything all at once, and then tomorrow you're going to feel better, because oftentimes tomorrow you don't feel better as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's, to use the word complex again, it's because of the complexity of trauma, whether you're looking at your own life, whether you're looking at other people. I think that what you're both highlighting is being patient and gracious, and still being hopeful for the fact that there can be recovery, even though trauma is a universal reality of living in a broken world. And it comes from a lot of different sources, can look a lot of different ways, but there's still hope, mm-hmm. still hope for healing. So I want to thank each of you guys for being guests today. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks.
Yeah. We want to thank you guys, our listeners, for joining us today. We hope that you'll join us next time on The Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture.
Thanks for listening to The Table Podcast. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.